everyone, It's here. It's been a year, so it's time for another entry in the Diary of a Wimpy Kid series. I haven't been looking at any details regarding this book, so I'm only aware of what I can easily gather from the cover and title. I'm glad I did this, so I can have an open mind about this book. I hope you all enjoyed today's video, and let's get straight into Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Partypooper. First off, let me just complain about the name a bit. Partypooper is a fine enough title, but why is it one word? I use online websites that rate the searchability of YouTube titles, and whenever I put in the actual title of the book instead of Partypooper in 2 words, it brings down the rating. Extremely minor complaint out of the way, let's talk about the book. The title page shows Riley as the second person in line right before Susan, so I definitely hope that he would have more significant of a role in this book. While it wasn't as much as I had hoped, he at least appears a decent amount in this book, and it's probably his most sizable appearance in a while. This book is about Greg's birthday, and there's one fact I need to address. Greg is perpetually 12, and he always has been, in the books at least. In the first book, Greg mentions having dealt with a cheese touch in the previous year, meaning he can't be a 6th grader. In The Ugly Truth, Greg talks about how he got a hand-me-down textbook from a kid in a grade higher in his school. That kid still goes to the same school, and Roderick's high school has been shown to be a different location, so you have to assume that he's in the 8th grade and that Greg is in the 7th. That's why I'm not going to say anything about Greg still being in middle school, despite multiple years clearly passing, because while the movies move in real time, the books have never followed that logic. When Greg mentions his birthday being Saturday, I was kind of surprised because I thought that this book would only take place over a week, which would have been even shorter than the single month of Hot Mess. But as we'll see in the book, that won't be the case. Now, I want to have a talk about Greg's character. While I feel like later books have exaggerated some of his personality traits, Greg hasn't always been the smartest, and there were some times when he was pretty naive. There's a point early on in the book where Greg talks about believing that wishes are real, which does admittedly feel a bit childish. But I have to admit at this point, that doesn't bother me as much because Greg has been written like this for so long that this is his personality now. Greg from the earlier books and Greg now are 2 different interpretations of the same character that stand on their own, and I need to accept that. Although, there are a few moments in this book where you can kind of see classic Greg shine through. On one birthday, a kid blew out Greg's birthday candles and ended up getting a dirt bike a few days later. When Greg goes to a wishing well, he hopes that the kid crashes his bike and that it gets destroyed. And there are a lot more moments than I expected where Greg is written like this. There's one point in the book where Greg talks about his experience being born, which I once again still believe is Greg lying to make himself look cool, just like in the 3rd wheel. The reason I mention this is because Greg depicts Frank helping Susan into the car while leaving Greg's baby seat on the ground while it's raining. This is probably not something that happened, but if it is, jeez. I've always still enjoyed parts of Diary of a Wimpy Kid's humor, and it especially still works in this book. While some parts are silly, events feel more grounded overall compared to previous entries. Greg is also still pretty lazy, mentioning how he struggles with writing thank you letters for birthday presents, which has been brought up before. I'm really enjoying how Greg has been written in this book so far, because it feels like a good blend of classic and modern. Greg recalls one birthday as a kid where he thought he would gain superpowers, so he invited his bullies to the party so they could use his lasers on them. Greg was planning on killing these kids. Greg goes into a discussion about superpowers, and he mentions different powers and origin stories that are clear references to certain heroes, but he doesn't say their names. I thought this had something to do with copyright, but then the book name drops Spider-Man and depicts other Marvel heroes. I'm genuinely interested in whether there are any restrictions on how often a character can be mentioned, or if it was a decision made on purpose. Also, I hate to say actually, but actually, Spider-Man's spider sense isn't affected by other heroes. His spider sense is only activated by people he sees as threats, such as Spider-Man playing poker with Kingpin, but non-threatening characters can't surprise him. The MCU surprisingly gets that detail right, as both Tom and Andrew's Spider-Man don't immediately react to food being thrown at them. Anyway, this is a Diary of a Wimpy Kid video. Here's another weird detail I noticed. Greg mentions how his next door neighbor moved away, but it's clearly a different person from his previous neighbors. Fregley lives next to Greg, it's been mentioned pretty consistently, and a woman named Mrs. Tuttle is shown to be his other next door neighbor in Wrecking Ball. I guess Mrs. Tuttle could have moved out, and this new neighbor moved in for a bit. Either that, or Greg's house exists on a 4-dimensional plane. There's one thing I want to talk about, but first, let's get into the main plot. Greg believes Susan is setting up a surprise birthday party, as Susan mentions a church event on the same day. Greg talks about how he typically spends his birthdays, and Greg's old personality really shines as he takes complete advantage of the day and makes himself the center of attention. It turns out that the Heffleys lost their calendar when they got their fridge repaired, and Susan forgot to put Greg's birthday on the calendar. Susan feels pretty bad about forgetting Greg's birthday, and Frank takes Greg to a comic book store. There, Greg learns about a factory defected trading card worth $100,000. It's a messed up version of a very common card from the franchise Micro Creatures, which is clearly a play on Pokemon. While the story Greg tells is definitely not relatable for everyone, it certainly is for me. While Pokemon has always been popular, an extra large wave of popularity hit around 2016, similar to what's shown with Micro Creatures. Pokemon Go took the world by storm, and I remember one of my classes got in trouble because one kid was searching up Blastoise EX cards instead of doing schoolwork. This part of the book really felt like it was made for people around my age. Anyway, Greg hopes to buy as many cards as he can in order to find the defective card, and his plans to hold as big a birthday party as possible in order to get the money. Getting back to what I was going to mention before, one significant difference I've noticed in modern entries, although a bit better in this book, is that Greg spends a lot more time talking about his thoughts than about what is happening in his life. It kind of leads to recent books having a far less eventful plot, as there's nowhere near as much time spent progressing the story as before. Another detail I've also noticed, but that's not super relevant, is that there are rarely any characters that look like Greg anymore. A lot of girls Greg's age used to look like him, and the Wimpy Movie Diary mentions how so many female characters look so similar. But now, there are essentially no new characters that have a similar design to Greg, which is an interesting evolution in the series' design philosophy. I've skipped ahead of a lot of examples, but similar to a lot of post-Big Shot books, there are a lot of callbacks to characters and even some events from previous books. We get mentions of the kid who got his head stuck in a chair, Albert Sandy, Greg's dentist, the lemonade stand kid from Old School, the cool Brian company from The Ugly Truth, Alex Aruda, Larry Mack Jr. from No Brainer. The events of Wrecking Ball are mentioned, as some construction equipment from back then is used to fence off the party. Also, the reason I assumed Mrs. Tuttle moved is because Frigley has a small cameo. I'm honestly surprised that some other previous supporting characters, such as Chirag, Bryce, Patty, and Holly, haven't returned, considering how many other characters have come back at this point. Another example of how diabolical Greg acts in this book is how, over the previous summer, he and Riley devised a plan to go to the birthday parties of countless people just to get free cake. What's especially crazy is that I'm not even sure if he knew the people whose birthday parties he was going to. On one birthday, Greg and Riley were the only people who showed up, but they ended up brightening the kid's day, and the parents were happy that they showed up. I skipped past this, but there's a side plot where Susan forgetting Greg's birthday was posted on social media, although the story was anonymous. People in the comments started trying to figure out who the people in the stories were so that they could make up for the birthday Susan missed. While this story sounds a bit crazy, if you imagine the social media website is being Reddit, then it makes complete sense. Greg is preparing for the party where he's inviting absolutely everyone, from friends to family and even neighbors. Greg's also planning on how to maximize the profits from his birthday party, which includes, but is not limited to, souvenir cups, paying to use the bathroom, premium toilet paper, a bouncy house that costs 25 cents per bounce, paid photos with Greg, a mostly paid seating arrangement, and a donation box on the gift table. Moving past Greg's future in EA, the party begins, and things immediately fall apart, as you can guess. There's a wedding in Greg's neighborhood, so everyone else has to park much farther away. Greg made an admission system, so he was sure all the kids brought gifts, and Riley was struggling to recognize them from their elementary school photos. Nobody was paying for the stuff, as they either ignored the price or got what they needed somewhere else. People from the wedding showed up and started hanging out at the party. There's some smaller storylines I didn't mention for time, but they also culminate here. The people online find out about the party, and they brought Greg a bunch of gifts. Then, things fully collapse. Greg refused to mow the lawn of their neighbor who had moved because he feared that there was something in there. It turns out that there was a deer, and he proceeds to run through the party, destroying everything. Most of Greg's gifts were damaged, but from what he saw, none of them were the card he was looking for. We then see that people had an after party at the aforementioned wedding, and one detail that I find really funny is how Greg's own grandfather ditched them and went to the after party. Greg invited a rich aunt of his to the party, and she ended up having a great time, so she bought Greg a pack of Micro Creatures cards. And what other card would Greg find but the defect card he's been looking for this whole time? Greg celebrates and hides the card as he plans to sell it. He's worried about Manny messing with it, so in a 40 chess move, Greg hides it under Manny's bed because he would never expect Greg to hide something there. Greg heads to the comic store and he finds out horrible news. The company behind Micro Creatures created a ton more of the defective cards to ride off its popularity. Greg checks his card to see if it's the original, and while we don't learn if it is, it doesn't matter, as Manny scribbled all over it. Sometime later at the store, Greg runs into the parents of the kid whose party he had gone to. They heard that Greg's party was really exciting, although I wonder if they know the reasons why, and they ask Greg if he can host their son's party this year. This ends up going well, and Greg and Riley continue doing birthday parties for people. This wasn't Greg's original plan, but with the money they're making, he's definitely not going to complain. This was honestly a refreshing book, and I'll admit that I wasn't expecting to have this much fun with it. Greg feels in character and like an active participant in the story. Events aren't happening to him, he is the direct cause of it. While not as severe as in earlier entries, Greg shows some signs of his iconic laziness and ego that have only appeared in short bursts in some recent books. The most over-the-top moments in the book don't even compare to the events of The Deep End or No Brainer, and that makes the slightly zanier moments more entertaining. While I would have loved to see more moments with some of the supporting cast, this is the most they've gone to do in a decent bit, especially Rowley, who's practically been absent at some points. I feel like I've given most of my opinions throughout the course of this video, but this is easily one of the better Wimpy Kid books I've read in a while, and based on my thoughts shortly after reading it, it's probably the best in this sort of new era after Big Shot. I thought the ending with Rowley and Greg hosting parties was just okay, as it feels a bit like a generic happy ending, and it probably won't be brought up again, but I can't excuse it because of how much I enjoyed this story. Hopefully, in whatever stories that come in the future, we can get some more grounded stuff like this, where the characters are in the forefront. I had a lot of fun making this video, and regardless of the quality of each individual entry, I'll always be glad to stick around with this series. I hope y'all enjoyed today's video. If you did, check out some of my other videos, and if you really did, consider subscribing so you know when future content comes out. That's me for now, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care!